It's been 1 year since Reverend Adam Shoemaker became the rector of the historic St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in downtown Charleston. In this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups, I sit down with the Reverend one-on-one. And be sure to download the free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. And listen to this interview later on the free Quintin's Close-Ups iHeartRadio podcast. Reverend Adam Shoemaker.
Yes.
It's so good to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Oh, I appreciate this greatly. Obviously, you are the rector for St. Stephen's Episcopal Church on iconic Anson Street. Describe you these days.
Well, I've been at St. Stephen's now for about 1.5 years and have had a wonderful start, I think, as pastor of the church. I am originally from New York City. Went to school in the Boston area and have served churches in Massachusetts, North Carolina, and now here in Charleston. Been ordained about 12 years.
What is the biggest difference between 12 years ago to right now?
That's a great question. I think there's things you learn in books, things you learn in seminary, and then there's things you learn, in the congregation, on the job. And this is now my second time as the priest in charge of a church, and I really am appreciative of the congregation I served in North Carolina for bearing with me with the mistakes I made as a first-time pastor there, and I think I am putting the lessons I learned in North Carolina to good work at St. Stephen's in Charleston. So, you learn a great deal, I think, on the job, and you grow every day. I mean, we're all growing day by day, so, yeah.
And you talk about St. Stephen's Church. Obviously, that particular church has a lot of history. What part of that history moment that really describes you as a rector?
I think I am a great fit for St. Stephen's, and the history of St. Stephen's was one of the things I fell in love with when I was a finalist in that process. St. Stephen's has been a church that has reached out to people on the margins since its founding. It was founded as a church for the poor in the early 1800s by 3 laywomen, which was unique at the time. It was a church, as the 1800s continued, for pregnant single mothers to go where they would not feel shamed. We became an African-American church in the early 1900s, and were so for about 60, 70 years. And then in the late 80s went through a period of intentional integration. And continue to be a pretty diverse congregation of the Episcopal Church in South Carolina, and that diversity, that inclination to reach out to people on the margins, that hunger for social justice is certainly something that animates my priesthood and my sense of ministry.
You talk about social justice. What is your definition of that right now?
I certainly think right now, and I think sometimes definitions like that can evolve given the demands of the time, but I certainly think in the divisive, I would say hate-filled time in which we live, I think social justice begins by respecting the inherent worth and dignity of every human being as God created us. I think it means striving for equity and trying to break down the barriers that separate us one from another and separate people from realizing their God-given potential.
You talk about, obviously, reaching out to people. How does St. Stephen's really do that in 2019?
One thing that we do right now that really started prior to my arrival, that is our clearest sort of mission endeavor, is an outreach we have to Sanders Clyde Elementary School.
My alma mater.
Is really? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, that's
Class
great.
1996.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So Sanders Clyde is an elementary school that our parish reached out to intentionally a few years ago, and year by year we have added to that mission. We send tutors, we send reading buddies, we have welcome back breakfast for the teachers, we do drives, coat drives we did during the holiday for the students there. Try to do what we can to support the students of that school. And I really, the church I came from in North Carolina had a partnership like this. I think that in today's times, investing in schools, investing in public education is an important ministry for local churches, because I think investing, particularly in younger children, I think can pay dividends for all of us in the long run.
What is the state of education in your mind?
I think it's pretty lacking, and I've certainly been paying attention to the Post and Courier's really groundbreaking and wonderful investigative reporting they've been doing on the state of the public schools here in Charleston, and I think reading some of the articles that they've written, you realize that in many respects we are still dealing with segregated schools in many regards. There's too many schools that are all white or all black, and there's not enough integration going on. There's not enough investment in public education. There's not enough valuing of our public school teachers. And that's why I think burnout is so high amongst people who work in the school system. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed legislatively. And I also think local communities need to do what they can, churches, nonprofits, to help lift up, our schools, give kids a better shot.
If you were to go up to Columbia and talk to the legislators about teachers and education right now, what would you say to them one-on-one?
I think I would say that especially young teachers need more support. I have personally known really well-qualified college graduates, idealistic. They've wanted to be teachers. That's what they went to school for. They got out into the school system, and they were not supported enough for it to feel like a viable vocation for them. And they got out after 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and are now in other professions. And we lose their talent, we lose their ability. Anything that can be done at the state level to help equip, train, mentor, support, invest in good qualified young teachers and to attract more young people to that, I think will be a great long-term investment in our kids in the long term.
And obviously, when you think of social justice, as you just mentioned, what is that one Bible verse that you would go to describe that?
Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God? Because I think justice is related to mercy, to compassion, to love, for the love that we have come to know in Jesus. And I think it is also something that needs to be practiced with humility, which, as I said in a recent sermon to my congregation, is something that is sorely lacking in our world today. From the highest reaches of government on down, we need to engage in justice work with humility, recognizing that we don't always have the whole truth, that we need other people to help us to approximate God's truth, and we need to reach out, particularly to those who are different from we are, and build community in order to achieve the kind of justice that we hope for and that I think God wants us to seek.
What is that justice in your mind?
I think equity. I think, if you look at a city like Charleston, if you look at most of our major cities across this country, there is a lack of equity. There's a lack of equity in education. There's a lack of equity in housing, adequate transportation. I think justice needs to be realized by helping to create a society where there is more equity, where there's more equality of opportunity, and where people are treated, fairly and with respect. I mean, obviously, it means a society that we strive to rid of discrimination and racism and all the ways that people have been historically made to feel less than. But I think you realize that legislatively in creating more opportunities for people.
Where should the conversation go next when you think of affordable housing and public transportation?
Well, I know that the Charleston Area Justice Ministry that I've gotten to know something about as I've come in to town last year focused on affordable housing and has decided that transportation is what they want to focus on this year. And it does feel to me, the Post and Courier has included a lot of articles about how the wealth gap in a city like Charleston, I think we have one of the biggest wealth gaps of many cities of our size across the country. And I think that's because poor people are getting pushed out of the downtown area but there's not enough public transportation to give people access to good, high-paying jobs. And so I think a city like Charleston, I think, I know we have a bus system, but I know we used to have a trolley system. I'm still getting to know the city of Charleston, but it feels like there could be more access to transportation, like a commuter rail or something, like a train system that could more quickly bring people into downtown from some of the surrounding communities where the populations are really exploding, like Mount Pleasant and North Charleston. But I think that there's lots of opportunity down here, downtown, but people have to be able to get there. I mean, if you can't afford an automobile or something like that, I mean, it's going to lock you out of a lot of good paying jobs. So I do think transportation is something that needs to be attended to.
And obviously, when you talk about affordable housing and public transportation, there's always a discussion about gentrification. And I'm wondering, when you look at Charleston and gentrification, how do we get here in your mind?
Well, that's interesting because I'm pursuing a doctorate of ministry at Duke Divinity School, right. And I am trying to write that thesis on the history of St. Stephen's, right. In relation to the gentrification of the neighborhood of Ansonboro, which I have learned was the neighborhood that the Historic Charleston Foundation began their work with by gentrifying that neighborhood. And our congregation's story was absolutely impacted by that effort, because we went from being a black congregation in a neighborhood that was largely African American to an increasingly white congregation in a neighborhood that became completely all white because of those efforts. And I think that gentrification, as I've begun to do the research and looked in the books about it, I mean, people debate about what the definition is of gentrification. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I think that there are probably positives to gentrification that can lift everybody who lives in a city, but I think the problem is that displacement is when a community feels forced out of a neighborhood. I think that's where you start to run into trouble. And I think in a city like Charleston, you need more. I mean, going back to Cajun's focus last year, right. In a city that's growing like Charleston so fast in such a tight area, there's got to be affordable housing, or poor communities are going to get pushed off the peninsula, essentially. I mean, the outgoing principal of Sanders Clyde, Dr. Bradley, right. who was wonderful and unfortunately was only able to be there a year. He had to move to Charlotte for personal reasons. Right. Had told me that it is very likely that the neighborhood immediately around Sanders Clyde is going to look very different in 10 years, 15 years, because the city is going to continue, its plans to expand the peninsula. Well, what's going to happen to the populations that are right there? We need to be providing space for everybody to have a seat at the table and a place in this lovely city, and I think that's what has to be attended to when you look at urban revitalization, because I think that kind of a word has too often meant, pushing poor people, African Americans out and bringing in wealthier white people. I mean, that's something that we have to figure out, a way around.
Who else would you bring to the table in the forms of the discussion about gentrification?
I mean, I think you should hopefully have local residents to have a voice in what's going on in their neighborhoods. I think having urban planners, as well as city government, and perhaps there are models in other cities of how gentrification has been done in a sensitive way, where local people and poor people have been able to still have an affordable base of housing in the area, and to learn from them about what's been happening. I mean, this is a big country, there's a lot of cities. I mean, I'm sure there's got to be some models that can be looked at that, lift up a positive way to uplift communities and to better a city without pushing and displacing poor people from having a place in that city.
And let me get back to you. Obviously, you're writing a thesis right now for Duke. If you were to write a thesis about your future, what would be the title?
That's a good question. faith seeking understanding, maybe. Another thing that you may not know about me, I have a diverse background. I'm half Egyptian. I have Christians, Jews, and Muslims in my family tree. I have brothers and sisters who live in Egypt on the other side of the world. My Christian faith has been indelibly shaped by my multi-faith background, and I think it has given me a sensitivity to the breadth and depth of God's truth in this world that speaks to the heart of why I preach things like humility to my congregation, because I don't think any of us should ever feel so confident in our truth, or I guess so dogmatic, that we don't make room for God to surprise us, or for God's truth to be very much present in other people, in other places, in foreign cultures, even in foreign religious traditions. And so I think, I strive to continue my walk with God, my Christian faith, my priesthood, with humility, trusting that, as I reach out and meet different people and form community in a city like Charleston, I'm learning, I'm growing, there's God's truth out there in other people, and God is making me more into the beloved person I've been called to be through that work that I'm doing in my congregation, in the city, and beyond.
That is so great to hear.
Yeah.
Well, Reverend Adam Shoemaker, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Quintin.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.